Good morning. This is Rich Sierra. I'm the president of Florida Small Business Legal Center here in Boca Raton, Florida. This is episode number 24 of Business SOS podcast. We're very excited. We continue providing you great content every week, and that was helpful to business owners. Today, I'm going to revisit a topic that I spoke about when we began this podcast a few months ago. So it's worth addressing it again, and also I want to focus on that particular topic this time. And there's going to be tips to negotiate your commercial lease. And I addressed in my book, Business SOS, in Chapter 4 specifically, mistake number 4 is signing a commercial lease agreement without an attorney. It is a very common mistake that business owners make, and it can have devastating consequences to your business if you do that. And I'm going to go over that and give you some tips. And when you're negotiating a commercial lease, what to look for, things that will come out that you have to basically pay attention to, and give you some suggestions. Again, this is just to be clear, just by listening to the podcast in and of itself, you will not become an expert in commercial leases. The objective of the podcast is to give you some insight and some additional tools that will help you ask better questions and focus on that. But my recommendation is if you are about to engage in a commercial lease, because all of them are different, all of them have some common themes and common clauses. Every lease is different because every landlord is different. My recommendation is to have an attorney review it with you that understands commercial leases and really explain to you what you're signing. And you know, my rule in contracts is that if you do not understand the contract, do not sign it. So let's go right in. Signing a commercial lease without an attorney is what I call mistake number 4. And I think one of the mistakes that people make, they do not understand the terms of the commercial lease. And a commercial lease is different than a residential lease. Residential lease, there's some safeguards in place, especially in Florida, that you have to have some requirements, some notice requirements, and it's designed to protect the residential tenant. They don't want people out on the streets because of some type of lease issue. So there's some protections that are embedded within the statute for residential leases. There's some, obviously, commercial leases are also protected by the statute, but they really benefit the landlord, if you want my opinion. They really don't benefit the tenant that well. So when you are into a commercial lease, you're looking at a retail space, you're looking at an office space, you're looking at a industrial warehouse. You're already at a disadvantage because the landlord's lease most likely was drafted by an attorney. If you have not read those leases before, or you're basically don't do this for a living, you're not going to, for the most part, you're not going to understand that document the first time you review it. So my recommendation is commercial leases, have an attorney review it. So one of the things that people misconstrue is when they say, how much is going to be my rent? And the landlord gives you rent to say, okay, it's going to be, $5,000 a month. Okay, so you work in your business plan, and you say, okay, I can afford that based on the business model that I have. I can afford $5,000. The reality is that it's not $5,000 a month. You're going to pay more than that. In some cases, like in Florida, you will pay sales tax on that lease, on that rent that you're paying. You also have common area maintenance charges. Those are charges that you will basically also call community association management, but basically the landlord is going to take all the expenses that he or she has and combine them into this group called CAM. And then they're going to divide that by the percentage of rent, the percentage of square footage that you have, and that's going to be your proportionate share of those expenses. So in addition to your base rent, you might have to pay another $500. And I'm using round numbers just to make it simpler. You might pay another $500 for CAM, okay, for additional expenses for the landlord that he or she will draw from you to pay the building expenses. You also may have to pay a proportionate share of real estate taxes as well. So the landlord's there to make sure that as much as he can, is to have that property pay for itself. That's why they're landlords. So you as the tenant will be paying for that for the most part. So when you look at what it's going to cost me to go into this lease, it's not just the base rent. That's just the beginning of the process. You will most likely pay, if it's a triple net lease that pays basically for all the expenses, you will pay for CAM, you will pay for real estate charges, real estate taxes, I'm sorry. You will most likely pay for insurance as well. The insurance of the landlord, he'll say, okay, we're going to pay you basically for the insurance. So you need to basically, when you look at the lease, first thing you have to look at is they give you a term sheet. They give you, okay, this is going to be, they give you a term sheet with an outline of what it's going to cost you. Ask for that term sheet and make sure that you understand exactly what you're paying for. What are your obligations? If it's going to be the base rent, $5,000, it's going to be an additional $500 for CAM. What is the proportionate share of real estate taxes? Find that out. If they say, well, we don't know it's going to be this year, they can give you an estimate. So, well, last year was this amount. It was another $300, for example. Find that out. Are there any additional charges that you need that were not included here? And I'll give you an example. Sometimes the landlord would, ask whether or not, if it's a retail space, are you planning to do any improvements in the property in the next 3 years while I'm in the lease? For two reasons you want to know that. For example, he's going to repave the parking lot. So they have the right, in most leases, to charge the tenants for that, a proportionate share. There might be additional expense. But also another reason you want to know that is that if you're looking, if your business depends on people coming in and parking, for example, utilizing the common area. And if you're going to start a business, whereas you're going to have a parking lot be a construction zone, that's going to be a problem, especially starting a new business. People do not like to be inconvenienced. And if you're a dry cleaners starting out and all of a sudden your customers have to basically go through a construction zone, it's not going to be enough parking there, you need to know that in advance. So at least you ask those questions. So in terms of the expenses, base rent, know what it is. The CAM charges, they can give you an estimate. They can give you an estimate of real estate taxes, insurance, that you'll have to pay the landlord's insurance, find that out as well. And anything else that they have not covered, ask for it. And it should be there in the lease. Sometimes they ask you for security for the place. They have a guard around. Ask that if it's not included already in the CAM. So that section is extremely important. An attorney can break that down for you and tell you, okay, this is where you need to be at. This is what it's going to cost you. Again, our objective is not to talk you out of it. Our objective is to give you the information that you need for you to make an informed decision on whether or not you can afford this lease to start your business or continue your business or move it to a different location. It ultimately is up to you. It's not up to us. But you need to have an understanding of what you're getting into. And an example that I give in the book, and surprised me, is how many business owners choose to go into leases without getting the proper advice, unless they have experience doing this before, is that when you sign the lease, you basically say it's a $5,000 a month lease. I'm using that number as an example. Okay, so you're looking at a $60,000 a year commitment. And in some cases, it's a 5-year lease. So it's a $300,000 commitment you're making right there on that lease agreement. And in most cases, in most businesses that are small businesses, there's a personal guarantee along with it, meaning that you're guaranteeing the performance of that lease. So next to payroll, and I'm willing to kind of make this assumption that it can be even greater than your payroll. The lease expense could be one of your highest expenses for your business. So that is one of the most important decisions you're going to be making as a business owner is that lease. So that's why I wanted to dedicate an episode talking about that, because that is, I talk about yellow lights. That is a yellow, almost a red light that you have to really pay attention to and do not take it lightly. Simply because once you decide to sign that lease, then you're committed and you got to put a large deposit. And to get out of leases, commercial leases, is very, very difficult. There are some exceptions. There's some ways to get out of it, but it's not that easy. And most likely you will lose money if you break the lease. Another clause that I want you to pay attention to is the option to renew. Okay, so you have, say, a 5-year lease, and you like the location, you like the retail space, you like the foot traffic. There is a good anchor store that brings people in for the type of business that you have. What is the option to renew? Will you be able to, after you develop the clientele around your local area and your radius, will you be able to renew that lease to really benefit another 5 years, for example, of the goodwill that you developed the last 5 years? You build that clientele for the first 5 years, and you're doing well. The last thing you want to do is move to a different location simply because you got to start all over again. So in your leases, it is a good idea to have an option to renew. What that means is that if you're in good terms with the lease, you have paid on time, you're a good tenant, you basically have everything is going well, you have the option to provide the landlord a notice. Sometimes it's 60 days, sometimes it's 90, 180 days, depends what the lease states. Said, I want to renew for another 5 years. So the landlord cannot rent the space to anyone as long as that option is still viable. That option is still valid. So that is a protection that you have in that case. Sometimes you can ask for one option to renew, two options to renew. Doesn't matter. It is your option. That's something that is in your benefit to have that option to renew. So ask for two. Just an example, because if you decide that you don't want to renew, simply say, you know what, I'm going to give you notice. I'm not opting to renew for another term, and then you can just leave. Okay, so option to renew is very important. The terms, the notices. There's also another benefit of having an option to renew clause or a number of options within your lease. So after 5 years in your business, you decide, you know what, I'm going to, for whatever reason, you decide that you want to sell. You said it's time for me to move on to a different direction. The business is going well. This is a good time to exit because I can get the maximum dollar from my business. So one of the due diligence documents you're going to be required to provide is going to be a lease agreement. And if you recall a few episodes past, I went through great detail on due diligence. If you're selling your business, if you're buying the business, I went through some examples, some of the documents, and I went through a checklist that I use in order to help you really prepare to sell your business, or if you're buying one, also to ask those questions. So the lease agreement becomes, in this particular, valuable asset to the extent that you have two options to renew. Say you're 5 years in, you're basically year number 4, you say, I'm going to go ahead and get a business broker. I'm going to put the business for sale. And they go ahead and, say, ask you for your lease. If you have no lease, if you have a lease that, let me rephrase. If you have a lease that only has 1 year left in your lease, then you have no option to renew. From a seller's perspective, then they're saying, okay, now we need to talk to the landlord to see what type of lease they'll provide to us, because we're not going to buy business with a 1 year assignment. It should just not make any sense to do that. Some people do it, unfortunately, and then they end up in my office. But from a buyer's perspective, they're gonna say you have 1 year left. So now the conversation is not going to be about the price of buying your business, the conversation is going to be you need to talk to the landlord, see are they going to renew this and for how long and what terms. Becomes a lease negotiation before you can even talk about selling your business. So having that option, it will not hurt you, will not cost you anything. It's something you want to negotiate right from the very beginning. And I suggest to do it, of course, with an attorney because those are clauses that are important to have, and it can only help you. Now, on the other hand, if you're thinking about selling your business and your lease agreement has another 2 5-year options, plus you have 1 year left in your lease, you have 11 years there that the new buyer can assume the lease. And there's some, provisions of lease assumptions, and we'll go over that in a few minutes. But for the most part, from the buyer's perspective, is say, you know what? Yeah, I like the location. You're doing well. I like the numbers. Everything looks good. Yeah, we can move in here. We can close in 60 days. And I still have pretty much 11 years or 10 years and, 10 and a half years that I can continue this business, get back my investment, but also, make a profit. So just from that perspective, an option to renew is extremely helpful. Now, with respect to assuming the lease, for the most part, you'll be able to assign the lease to someone else. Okay. However, in most leases that I've seen, pretty much all leases that I've seen, the landlord must approve the assignment. You cannot assign the lease without the landlord's knowledge. Number of reasons. Number one, it's in the contract, so you doing that it's a violation of the lease agreement. Number two, the landlord has the right to know who's operating, who's working, who's actually in his premises. There's a lot of liability involved when somebody opens a business where there's potential liability or exposure when somebody's operating in your premises, and he has the right to know who's operating in that property. So, and I had an example, I actually have it in the book. One of my clients, a gift store owner, basically bought this business from people that she knew, and was and she took it over. But what they did, there was no attorneys involved. What they did is basically they created a lease, quote unquote, assignment. So you're going to be taking over this business. We're going to sell it to you. You pay us like $50,000, but what we're going to do, you're going to pay rent to us, and then we're going to pay it to the landlord. So she went in there. She paid the $50,000, and something happened. She tried to get her business tax receipt in that city, and one of the things that they asked her for is the lease agreement at the city. Said, you know what? Yeah, you need a business tax receipt? Yes, of course. We need a copy of your lease. And she said, well, I have this assignment. And there was kind of a very rudimentary assignment document prepared. It wasn't prepared by an attorney. So they said, well, this is not signed by the landlord. We need the original lease and we need the assignment. And she said, I don't have that. She said, well, you cannot operate that business in our city because you do not have a business tax receipt. She went back to the landlord. She went back to the seller and said, listen, I need the lease. I need a business tax receipt. I cannot operate. No, that's fine. That's what they told her, quote unquote. Talk to the landlord. It's going to be okay. She went to the landlord and said to the property manager, in most commercial retail spaces, you will have a property manager. For the most part, very seldom, unless it's a small strip mall, you will not deal with the landlord directly, but this particular case was a property manager. And I said, I need a copy of the lease so I can get my business tax receipt. First, they asked her, who are you? And she explained. And said, well, why are you in this business premises? So, because I bought the business and then the tenant, the client, gave me assigned the lease. Here it is. And she said, no, this is not valid. Number one. Number two, you should not be operating this business. Number three, you need to get out. So think about the nightmare scenario. And this is a real example that happened. The nightmare scenario she has, and then that's when she contacted my office. That, in essence, she bought a business that she cannot operate. And, excuse me, and this happens very often. This is not something, I'm not giving an example that is kind of an outlier. I'll give you an example that actually happens all the time. Sometimes people are very familiar with each other, they know each other, there's a comfort level, and formalities are just not followed. Unless the buyer and the seller are sophisticated and they understand the process, I do not recommend going into these transactions without an attorney, because unfortunately, once the money's paid, and then, yes, you can get a lawyer and sue. It's not that easy, and I went over that in a couple of episodes back about litigation and the reality of litigation. In fact, my last podcast dealt with the Can You Afford a Lawsuit? One of the two podcasts ago. So it is very difficult. So you basically spend 50 grand on buying this business and then find out you cannot operate it. Then you're going to spend a few $1,000s more to try to get that money back. So that all could have been avoided, all of it, if the client would have sought legal advice at the very beginning. Tops, maybe $1,000 would have cost her. Maybe to review the lease, some advice, a few hours of an attorney's time. So it is important, and I'm impressing this upon you, commercial leases, please get an attorney. I want to talk about personal guarantees as well. For the most part, when you're dealing with a small business context in a commercial lease, you will be required, and I have not seen yet a commercial lease that does not require some type of personal guarantee from the owner. What that means, if you have an S corp, an LLC that you're operating under, and obviously the corporation signs the lease, but the landlord wants to protect himself or herself. And I said, yes, I'll give you a lease. Not only are you going to give me a deposit for first month and last month and security, you're also going to give me a personal guarantee, meaning that you personally guarantee the performance of this lease. And many clients tell me, I don't want to sign that. And I said, that's fine. You're not getting a lease. That's the reality. Okay? They're not going to give you, for the most part, a lease without personal guarantee unless you are prepared in some cases to put a substantial deposit that protects the landlord. So that can be negotiated. If you have the cash to say, you know what, I'm not going to give you personal guarantee, but I'm willing to put 5 months deposit, the landlord might say, okay, I can live with that. Depends. You can negotiate that. You can also negotiate, I don't want to give you personal guarantee for the 5 years, but I'm willing to give you a personal guarantee for 1 year. And after that year, if I'm good for 1 year, I pay on time, I'm in good terms, I want that personal guarantee to be extinguished. So you can negotiate that as well. Something else you can negotiate is that you can also say, okay, I'll give you a personal guarantee, but the maximum that I'm willing to guarantee it for is for 1 year. Just an example. There are ways you can negotiate this and ways that you can work that, but for the most part, you might be required to provide one. So just be aware of it, read it, and understand that most likely it's usually at the end of the document. So just pay attention to that. Okay. The last point I want to make in commercial leases, well, 2 points I want to make that I think are important. The repairs and improvement. There's a section in the lease for the most part that has, maintenance or repairs there are different line items or different subject headings on that lease, but it tells you, tenants' responsibilities. What are you responsible for in that lease? One thing that I recommend my clients that if you're going to a brand new space that, there was a tenant before that or a tenant, somebody had it before, do an inspection. Number one, understand from that section what you're responsible for. And I'll give you an example. You will be responsible for the most part for the AC unit, the HVAC unit. So I recommend my clients to get a AC company, come in and do an inspection of the AC, take a look at it and find out how many years I have left in this unit. How old is the unit? How was it maintained? Do they have maintenance records? The landlord has a maintenance records on that unit. And if you're about to go on a 5-year lease, but the unit is 10 years old, there's a likelihood that within those, year 11 to year 15, that AC will have to be replaced. So you have to kind of say, okay, so in that particular case, you tell the landlord, if that AC breaks down, you're going to replace it. I'm not going to replace it. But you have to know that you have to negotiate that right from the very beginning. The landlord will tell you when you come into the space, the AC is going to be working. They will make the representation. It's going to work for the next 60 days. It's going to work fine. But the lease will most likely tell you that you're going to be responsible for maintaining the AC and, if necessary, repairing the AC. So you have a 5-year lease. Your AC is 10 years old. You're going for year 11 to 15, and you have 2 options to renew for the next, 15 years. So you have 10 more years. So you have 15-year lease with 2 options to renew. There's a guarantee that AC will have to replace at some point. Who's going to replace it? That's essential to know. So I want you to at least, if you leave with something here today, you're about to look at a lease, get somebody to inspect the premises, to inspect the AC to make sure you don't end up holding that bill. With that, also you have electric, you have plumbing. If you're a restaurant, you're some type of food service, I will do a pest control inspection as well. Find out who are the tenants around you. All those inspections might cost a few $100s, but it's money well spent. If at the end of the day, you look at that, you spend a few $100s, but you say, you know what, this lease is not working for me, the worst can happen. You lost a few $100s, but you know what? You save yourself $300,000 or $400,000 in headaches and aggravations. So just understand that. Another point I want to make is oral agreements and leases. In Florida, they're not valid. So what happens is this. Sometimes, and this happens a lot when the owner of the building, you're dealing directly with the landlord. Say you've been in a property for 10 years. You're thinking about leaving. You're not really sure. And then you're about to renew the lease, but the landlord doesn't renew it. So keep paying me. That's fine. Month to month. It's okay. We're good with that. Or you basically do not pay the lease, the full payment of the lease. Sometimes happens that you say you cannot fulfill your lease obligations. Business is slow. It happens to everybody. And all of a sudden, you're basically paying half a rent, you're getting behind. And the landlord says, no, we're good. Don't do anything. Or the landlord forgets to do the annual increases that usually go with these leases, and that's part of the rent, how often the rent escalation. But then, say 2 years pass and you're in that kind of informal mode, but you're behind, but you're good with the landlord, it's your friend. He made that oral agreement. So the landlord sells the building. And when he sells the building, the new management company comes in and says, oh, well, you know what? This tenant is behind the rent by 2 years. He owes us $30,000. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to get a bill for $30,000. They're going to give you 10 days, if they're lucky, you're lucky, to pay that. He said, well, the landlord told me that I could pay less. If it's not in writing, it will not be binding. Especially in Florida, real estate transactions must be in writing. So in that particular case, you have to make sure there's an amendment to the lease, get it in writing from the landlord. So any type of informal agreements, don't do them, because very likely will not be binding on you. The landlord already sold the building. You're on your own. So I want to leave you with those points for today. If you have any questions about lease agreements, if you have any questions about any topics that you would like me to cover, please send me an email at rich@richsierra.com. If I select your question, I'll send you an autographed copy of my book, Business SOS, 8 Common Legal Mistakes Business Owners Make and How to Avoid Them, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and you can ask for your local bookstores. If you'd like to learn more about the legal services that we offer, my website is floridasmallbusinesslegalcenter.com. We're in Facebook at FSB Legal. Also, if you want to watch this podcast being on the video, we're on youtube.com at Richard Sierra. If you're watching this on YouTube, I ask you to please subscribe. This helps the algorithm suggest this to other business owners. We're on Instagram at FSB Legal. Our number is 866-842-5202. If you like the podcast, please follow us. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you enjoy your shows. I appreciate a review. That certainly helps promote the podcast and helps other business owners as well. Share it with your friends. Until next week, this is Rich Sierra. Remember that my goal is to help you succeed.